Welcome everyone to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and I'm happy to have Megan come join me as a co-host as we interview the creator de jure, I'll say, of ex-Mormonism or Mormonism, both, Ganesh Cherian. Thanks for being on the show.
Lovely to be here.
So Ganesh has recently published the book that he's been promising since I think the 1700s. Started writing it, and I first heard about it just before Sunstone 2 years ago, and Sunstone's knocking on the door at the end of this month, where I'll see him again. Right? You're going to present.
Yes, absolutely.
Just let's give a little plug for Sunstone. What's your presentation at Sunstone?
So I will be talking about the book and talking about some of the findings from the book and also how to use the book, because in many ways I wrote it as a kind of a reference book. You could utilize it.
Let's say the title of the book at the very least.
Oh yes, yes. Sorry, it's Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism, and it's a topical biography. So it's looking at his life with various themes and tracking that from his emergence, his beginnings, his family, his culture, through his life, particularly his early life, and then into the Book of Mormon. So that's a significant point at which he really changed the trajectory of his life. Then the early church, of course, as an emergence into New York and then Ohio, and then the church as it changed and pivoted with the politics and the environment of the time through to Missouri and then to Nauvoo. So it's hopefully it gives the reason I didn't start out to write a biography. I was really maybe 4 years ago looking at some of the things from Sunstone actually in New Zealand. I couldn't go, but because of COVID, they had all these things online and you could watch some of these things. And one of the presentations I watched was William Davis's talk on the performance aspect of the Book of Mormon and talking about his book Visions in a Seer Stone. And that just blew me away, because I hadn't ever thought of the Book of Mormon as a performance. I'd always thought of it as a book, because that's what it's called, right? The idea that Joseph created it as he spoke it was revolutionary to me. And then not long after that, TikTok, started becoming a big thing, and Dan McClellan, although he was doing biblical stuff at the time, he said a couple of things about the Book of Mormon that really got me, and that was, of course, it's a 19th century text, and I'd already got to the point where I understood and knew that it was a creation of Joseph and his environment, but the idea that it was a 19th century text and the best way to understand the Book of Mormon was through a 19th century lens, that just so intrigued me. And so those two points really made me think, what? And I noticed some things about the Book of Mormon, like we all do. Why is it like this? And why does it work like this? And how come this changed over the course of the church? Because what's in the Book of Mormon is not necessarily what happened by Nauvoo. And I thought about 2 or 3, 4 of those things. I thought I'd write a little article about that and just track the chronology of that. Because, and the reason why I like that methodology is that it just helped me to put things in place. When the church released the Gospel Topics essays, particularly the one about polygamy, I never really had a big problem with polygamy. I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and went on. It wasn't a big deal to me. There were other things that were important to me, and I've talked about it before, that violence in the early church and racism were the two big pivot points for me that made me think, gosh, is this really God's word? Is this really God's church? So, but polygamy wasn't one of those things. Polygamy, I was like, they did that. I don't care. But then when the church released that Gospel Topics essay and I read through it, I realized I had no idea about lots of things. Firstly, I didn't know that Joseph practiced polygamy, but I didn't understand how this came about, why this came about, and how it affected things over time, because the three gospel topics essays were about, Joseph Smith's polygamy, then the polygamy in Utah, and then the ending of polygamy. And I realized I knew nothing, and it scared me, and it hurt me, because I'd been an institute teacher, a seminary teacher, a bishop, missionary, so. And I realized there was this key part of the church that I did not know anything about. Or what I knew was so rudimentary. It felt like I knew nothing. And so I did a huge deep dive. 6 months. I did, of course, Lindsay Hanson Park's Year of Polygamy. And then I wrote an article for Kiwi Mormon, which Gina Colvin was doing at the time, and did a chronology of polygamy from, right from the very beginning, right through the Book of Mormon, right through Joseph's life, right through Utah, right through, how this kind of worked in the 20th and the 21st century. And that chronology gave me a huge amount of understanding of how this particular issue, polygamy, had impacted the church. And I realized, in the top of the title of that particular essay was polygamy, it's in our bones. And the idea of it was that polygamy was the skeleton of the church. Like everything revolved around the church. So the warts and the ways that we were contorted and the form that we had was all to do with the skeleton that was underneath. And if you're a sculptor and you're looking at the human body, it's one thing to look at what's on the outside, but if you really understand what's going on the inside, you can understand why it expresses on the outside. And so that particular way of understanding a particular theme or idea or topic through the chronology of the history really made me feel safe. I could understand it, and it helped me to not be upset by it anymore, because I could understand what happened, the people involved, and the circumstance that led to these things, and I could relieve my angst.
That's
and
right.
So when
as an exercise,
so then when I did that those topics with regard to the Book of Mormon and Joseph's life, when I learned about some of these techniques from William Davis and Dan McClellan, I tracked a couple of things that I'd noticed that I thought I could ascribe to Joseph's environment that carried through from his early life through the Book of Mormon into the early church and then beyond. And when I did that, I noticed there was a pattern, and it was a very clear pattern, and the two biggest data points were the Book of Mormon, what was written in the Book of Mormon, and what happened in Nauvoo. So those are the two data points, the big ones. But before the Book of Mormon, there was Joseph's life, there was Joseph's family, there was Joseph's environment, there was the history of the United States. All of that was there. And then after Nauvoo was kind of what Brigham Young or others did with the information that Joseph did. So there was that. And then in between, there was the beginning of the church, and there was Kirtland, and there was Missouri, and there was usually some significant pivot point where some kind of idealism hit reality and crashed and burned, and Joseph had to pivot, and he pivoted in a interesting way depending on the circumstance. And so I found 3 or 4 of these, and they just made a great article. And I thought, this is great. That this will be a fabulous article. And then I thought, well, maybe I could do this around the other way. I could, I was really looking at the Book of Mormon mostly and how things changed. But then I could say, well, what happened in Nauvoo? And can we track that back to what happened in the Book of Mormon? And so then when I reversed the pathway, I managed to find lots of other things that I hadn't even thought about. And then I started to talk a bit to people about this particular trajectory, and they had things that they recognized that I was totally oblivious to. And suddenly,
crowdsourcing.
Yeah, well, I just thought, I was going to put out this little article. We're going to talk about it. It was going to be fun. Here's Joseph at 23 years old, writing his ideas and ideals into the Book of Mormon. And here's him in Nauvoo. He's a grown man with a family, and these ideals no longer are practical. So he's changed. He's a different person because of the circumstance. And so that was just a great thing to look at. And then when I started to, these things started to pile up. So now there's 45 in this book. There are 45 different topics, and there could have been more. It's just those are the 45 I could find really strong. Nice chronologies right through where you could go, this happened here, and this happened here, and this happened here, and this happened here, and this happened here, which showed that it was, firstly, all Joseph, like everything is Joseph, but also that you could understand why you went from this particular idea through to this particular idea, because of the circumstance that presented itself along the way.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, and so then it turned into a biography because, it was really all about Joseph. Like, it wasn't about the Book of Mormon anymore, and it wasn't about Nauvoo anymore, and the only connecting factor was Joseph, how Joseph is feeling, what's happening to Joseph, who he's engaging with, what situations present themselves, how he's reacting. That's it. And effectively, the church stopped at Nauvoo. The modern church is different, but there's no new great doctrines, and some of the things that Brigham Young kind of tried to further, didn't get very far or got walked back to kind of what they were at Nauvoo. So, we're still a Joseph church, despite the church, wanting to jettison him and find Christ and everything. So, if you're going to understand Mormonism and its bones, its skeleton, then you have to understand Joseph. And this is the skeleton. I can, hopefully what I've done is show enough points, and 45 I think is a good effort, that you can go, oh, I understand this topic now in its chronology and why it happened this particular way. That's and everybody's going to be moved by a different thing, right? Like I said, the things that really worried me when I first was looking at the stuff was, violence and racism. But some other people, it's not that. It's poverty or land or prominence or politics, or and so there are 45 topics which cover all of those things. And I think that even if this was my plug for the book, you would find 5 things that are really important to you that you could read and go, oh, okay, I understand that now. And you'd probably find 5 things that you go, oh gosh, I can understand why this might be important to somebody else. It wasn't now important to me, but it is. And then there will be another 5 things you go, gosh, I was totally oblivious to this even being the case.
On the radar.
Yeah.
What church is this? I've never heard this before.
Well, I think the thing that probably fascinates me the most, it's just what you're saying, is that understanding the skeleton. So if we go back to Joseph Smith's early days and the environment that he was raised in, his place in his family system, how did those environmental factors impact who he became when he started to teach the things he started to teach publicly?
Yeah, and I was going to say we're probably going to title this, speaking of bones, the stew that Joseph Smith simmered in, right? And so what was happening in the early 1800s that the Smith family were in their environment?
Oh, look, the more I dug, into his life, but also the environment that he was in, you realize that he very much is a product of his time. There's the 1812 war was huge. This was a pivotal moment for the US in establishing themselves as an independent country. This was when they were tested in their resolve. Could they stand up to Britain? And they did. So this was a massive patriotic moment, and Joseph was right there, on his bed because he was, had leg surgery, reading about this in the paper because these things were happening in his immediate environment.
Related to that, there was a textbook called The Late War, which if you read that, you think you're reading another chapter of the Book of Mormon, actually.
Yeah, because it was just the vernacular, the literary style of the day, so yeah, he was immersed in that.
That's right. The fourth month of the seventh day of the 1700 year since 76 is coming upon us pretty soon, right?
You're speaking in code, Gene. I can't understand what date you're talking about. It's crazy, isn't it? The first day of the first month of the year. Oh, New Year's Day? I guess. Okay, that's right.
But it just sounds so much fancier if you say it the other way.
That's right. One of the things I think influenced Joseph the most was his poverty. Like he was, and we just don't talk about this enough, how poor and desperate his family was. They were near to destitute, and how much responsibility Joseph felt in alleviating that. And also some of the resentment he had around having to alleviate that, but also some resentment that he had about the wider community, the wider environment that led to his family being in desperation. And because his parents came from wealthy families, well-to-do families, well-educated families. They were effectively, founding, citizens. The Smith family had been in the Americas since 1630, and they had done well in New England. And Joseph's mother had a huge inheritance, and this got lost, swindled out of them. And so, he grew up understanding those stories very well, but also being the poor cousins. Like the Smith family were the ones that the rest of the family looked down on because they had, squandered their means, and they hadn't amounted to much, and there was all these mouths and no money. And like his Smith uncles and his Mac uncles were all incredible people who did these amazing things and were, turning heads and doing lots of great things. And so
that's the more important thing to have in your family, is somebody that you can point to and say, don't be like that cousin.
Yes, that's right. They were the cautionary tale. They were the cautionary tale for their family. They were also the cautionary tale for Palmyra. Look at those Smiths. They're superstitious. They've lost their farm. They're, digging in the hills at night. That Joseph Smith Sr. is drunk all the time. He's telling these far-fetched stories. Nobody believes him. These are the underpinnings of Joseph's reaction, right? He's poor for one thing. He doesn't want to be poor. It's not much fun. He doesn't know when his next meal's coming.
That's right. The poverty dictates where they live, and it dictates the jobs that his parents are trying to get. Yep. Can you name a few of the jobs that the parents had?
That was probably another resentment, right? She was probably the primary breadwinner of the family. She was doing her textiles. This was providing income. They did have a family farm and orchard, but that was not always very productive. Once when Alvin died, of course, that medical misadventure that plunged them into disarray and poverty. the parents were getting older, their abilities were slowing down. There was plenty of mouths to feed. Joseph was one of the older siblings, and he's required to get out and work. And it's miserable. It's day laboring. It's uncertain. It pays poorly. It's just. And so why not go out at night searching for treasure? That's much more adventurous and fun, and why not make a business out of that? Even though there's not, can we make a business out of it? They're entertainers at some level, right? Because
it was
treasure.
a side hustle, basically.
Yeah.
My day job's not making enough. And wasn't at least one of his brothers fairly well educated?
So Hiram, the parents were well educated, and so they couldn't provide for all their kids, so they sent Hiram to Dartmouth, or to Indian Moors Charity School, which was attached to Dartmouth. Probably got in on a charity, schema. We don't have any money.
Family legacy.
Yeah, one of the kids. We'll send one of the kids. He'll be the person who kind of provides. Alvin was the oldest son. He was the worker. Hiram would be the academic. Joseph would be the worker as well.
Yeah. So did that necessarily mean, since Hiram got to go to college, that essentially Joseph would not be able to go to college? He had to forfeit that opportunity for his older brother in favor of him being the worker. Yeah.
And then of course he was lame. He got typhoid, and the infection would go to the bone in his leg, and suddenly he's lame. So he's actually in bed. He's not even contributing to the family. And that's a drain. It's a drain on the family. So how does he explain the reason why he is, he can't contribute? Well, it's because he turned into a hero story. He's trapped in his room in a jail cell, right? And how does he explain that he's there and his family are out there? Well, he must be preserved for something greater. He's the hero. Isn't that the same story that we see today? When how are you going to explain the fact that you're in a terrible situation, or you don't have freedom?
And also to make Hiram's education sort of be cost effective, it would make sense that Hiram would share with his family all the things that he was learning. So if Hiram learned Greek and Chaldaic and Hebrew, he might have taught his brother those things.
Yeah, and Hiram would have been expected to tutor the rest of the family, and he probably spent the evenings doing that, right? Reciting his stuff.
Wasn't that fairly common during that time period for one of the children to receive higher education, with the expectation that they would come back and tutor their family members, maybe other people who live nearby?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And look, they had been wealthy, so all of them should have gone to school, right? The fact that only one of them got to go to school was it would have been a pain. It would have been a heartache for Lucy and Joseph Smith Sr., right? Joseph Smith Sr. was a school teacher. This was not how they expected their lives to turn out.
And you know what, Ganesh, I think, the fable that Joseph Smith was uneducated is in part because Lucy Mack Smith, I think, wrote how Joseph Smith couldn't keep up with the book reading that maybe she wanted him to. She wanted to read the classics. He didn't want to read the classics. He wanted to read the pirate stories, the dime store novel type things, the exciting things.
Modern day comic books.
Yeah. You can. I mean, when you think about the Smith family as a real family, not just a caricature of what you think, you can hear the dynamics in the text, right? Lucy Mack's biography. You can hear the things that she feels like is important. Her family is important. Her dad and Joseph Smith Sr.'s dad's exploits in the Revolutionary War are important, and her dad's exploits in the French War are important. You know, the prominence of the family, the idea that, you know, because she's got the same thing. They're really poor. How does she explain that? Well, they're really righteous in the background. You know, Joseph Smith Senior's got dreams. She spends a great deal of her memoir talking about her husband's visionary dreams, how that was leading the family to something greater.
So they weren't seeking after riches; they were seeking out after the Word of God and visions.
Yeah, that's the way to. And gosh, who wants to be the villain of their story, right? Everybody's the hero of their story. So you're going to frame it.
It strikes me, Lucy, sort of rounding the corners of the uncomfortable truth that Joseph Smith Sr. drank quite a lot and was prone to tall tales. So rather than admit that on its face, she would say, well, he had dreams and visions. I wonder if that's an accurate portrayal or if that's stretching it too far.
Well, I think that you can see that in the text of First Nephi, right, with Sariah complaining about her visionary husband, and Nephi, you know, defending the father with these ideas that he's seeing these great things. He's he's providing for the family in a different way, and this is going to lead to our greatness, our promised land. You know,
eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, he sent me out on this quest to retrieve the plates, and this is going to save the family, and we're going to be bestowed, you know, inheritance from God because we're so righteous. You know, these are the dynamics in the Smith home. You can learn a lot about. I mean, the Book of Mormon's an autobiography, so you can learn a lot about the roles of various people depending on the characters and how they relate to each other. Because Joseph is using something, right? He's using his own experience, and he's crafting that into the narrative. And there are a number of different narratives that give us an understanding of that. And when you know that that's what's happening, then you can see it. You can see the dynamics, and you can see them as a real family. Yeah, there are conflicts here, and they are working through it. And Joseph,
you know, in a way, as Mormons, we're supposed to be reading between the lines, right?
That's right. Applying all things. Well, actually, he says that, right? You know, apply the scriptures to ourselves. Well, apply
liken them unto us
to Joseph Smith's life, maybe even to ourselves here.
Yeah, so I love to think about the idea of, you know, really thinking of Joseph as a real person and the role that he played in his family, the role that was assigned to him, and the fact that he didn't like that role. He didn't feel like that fit for him. And so he came up with a side hustle of treasure digging, you know, and then also later on sort of recreated that narrative where he became the hero in his own story.
And one of the dynamics that I think is the most fascinating for me is the brother dynamic, right? So, you know, Joseph is Nephi in the story, right? But Hiram is Sam. He's the benign older brother who the younger brother can count on, but is not a great leader, you know? And this is the dynamic that plays out in Joseph's early life, right? You know, Alvin was the leader. That was the one Alvin is Joseph's hero. Hiram is the reluctant successor to Alvin. You know, Alvin took care of everything. He took care of the family. When Joseph Smith Sr. was, you know, not performing, Alvin went out and got the money for the mortgage payment. Like, Alvin was the hero of the family, and his death devastated them emotionally and financially because Joseph Smith Sr. could not provide, and he was not providing. And so, and it's 19th century America, men are supposed to be in charge. Lucy Mack is incredibly capable. She is providing. She's doing her textiles. So this meant that it fell to Hiram to be the next in charge, and he is not a leader. He is, at this particular point in his life, he's not a leader, and that's not the way that Joseph sees him. he is Limhi in the story, right? He's a tributary king. He's not Zenith, who's the go-getter. And Hiram is the placeholder because they've got nobody else, or at least Joseph Smith Sr. is unreliable, but Hiram's not a leader. So Nephi has to step up, Mosiah has to step up, Alma has to step up. These are all facets of Joseph. He has to step up, and he resents it at some level because he's the younger brother, but he wants to be the one in charge too, right? He's got ambition. So, there's that interesting, odd dynamic of, why do I have to be, take care of this family? And at the same time, I'm the man,
Yeah.
So, and this plays out in Joseph and Hiram's relationship going forward, because of course, Joseph comes up with the Book of Mormon and Hiram supports him. There's Doctrine and Covenants section 12 is where Joseph gives advice to Hiram, how you support me. Well, you can read the Book of Mormon and you can apply it. And
yeah, that's the other part of this that I find so fascinating, looking at these different family roles, is the roles that Joseph then assigned his family members within the church, the callings that he gave them. So can you speak a little bit about that and, how those two things are related? Yeah,
so, Hiram's a good example, right? So he's given lots of missionary opportunities, and Samuel too. Samuel is Jacob in the Book of Mormon. He is younger brother, but dynamic. Samuel's dynamic. Joseph sends him out on a mission, like right at the very beginning. He's a go-getter. He loves his younger brother Samuel, and Samuel just makes things happen. Hiram it is reliable but benign, right? So so Joseph gives him a number of roles that he excels in because he's got good direction, and he just knows he just gets stuff done. So Joseph gives him the role to take care of the printing of the Book of Mormon. So he's the one who takes the pages of the printer's manuscript back and forth to the printer and oversees that process and makes sure that it gets done, and none of the pages get lost, like the lost manuscript, all that kind of stuff. And he's very reliable. So Joseph is able to kind of give him roles where just stuff gets done. But Hiram ends up becoming really valuable to Joseph. In fact, becomes an incredible leader in his own right. But this takes years before Joseph trusts him like that. Like it doesn't happen until, really, Hiram does some good things, 33, 34, but it's really not until kind of 37 that Hiram's now in Joseph's inner circle. I mean, and Joseph loves Hiram. It's not that he doesn't. It's just that, Hiram gets better by as he goes on, and by the end, of course, when they die together, Hiram is Joseph's right-hand man. But and the other dynamic is
it was Oliver Cowdery, right?
Yeah, so it was Oliver Cowdery first, then it was Sidney Rigdon, and then Oliver Cowdery, tried to reinsert himself, which he managed to do, and then effectively it was Hiram. Sidney never kind of recovered. Yeah, just lots of little interesting things. But the coolest thing is his father, Joseph Smith Sr. Of course, Joseph loves his dad, doesn't always agree with him, and slightly resentful because his dad's not a provider. But he does elevate his father, and particularly his visionary gifts, which become, of course, patriarchal blessings in 1834. And then Joseph Smith Sr. Has a job as the church patriarch. Joseph elevates him. Right up here, right? There's the first presidency, and then there's the church patriarch. It's separate, but he kind of elevates him to that point. And
I think he makes $2 a blessing that he gives.
That's right. He gets paid. So Joseph Smith Sr. probably hasn't had an income in maybe 15 years, and suddenly he is a major breadwinner in Kirtland. For
and
his
the patriarch
family.
was the first office set apart with the holy, using the proper order of the Holy Melchizedek priesthood when they all got together. I think it's 1835. There were seven groups.
Yeah.
Patriarch was first, and then maybe stake president or other things were happening. And then the last was the apostles.
Yep. Yeah, they were further down the track. Yeah, so Joseph saved his father, saved him from emotional ruin, financial ruin, and and standing in the community. Suddenly, Joseph Smith Sr. was, elevated for his visionary gifts, for his odd, weird behavior. Like he was a mystic. He was the mystic of the church.
Respected now.
Just like Nephi did. Nephi got the plates, right? Nephi made himself a steel bow and arrow so that the family could survive. Nephi,
built the boat.
Nephi handled his brothers and had to shock them into submission sometimes. He was always saving his dad's butt.
Yeah. Oh, it's just, once you see it, of course, you can't unsee it. And it's actually quite beautiful. If you're going to describe your family dynamics as an adventure story, well, it's pretty good,
It's not bad when you think of it that way. I keep going back to thinking about Mark Twain reading it and saying that it was chloroform in print. And I think that's maybe just because there was a little too much filler in between the things that were really actually very interesting. And, I don't know if you can speak to why Joseph felt the need to, put in all of the bits that most people don't appreciate, like the olive tree allegory and things like that.
Well, it goes back to the performance aspect of the Book of Mormon, right? Like it's not a book, right? He's got an idea of what's the end game, but that, and so he's got scripts in his head of stories that he's going to tell, and maybe the lessons that he's getting to. However, this is a play, so when he performs what he has designed, he gets a reaction, and the reaction tells him what the audience is interested in and what they want to hear more of, right?
Yeah, I remember correctly that Lucy Mack commented that he used to entertain his family with these stories long before he wrote the Book of Mormon, so he'd already tested a lot of this material.
Yes, exactly. And and it's good fun. At the first instance, right? It's entertainment first and foremost, but secondary, it's a means to an end, right? People are enjoying it, then they're also reciprocating with resources and investment, and like lots of people complain about all the Isaiah at the beginning of the Book of Mormon in First and Second Nephi, particularly. And one of the reasons I think that this is all there is there are a couple of reasons, but one of the big reasons is his audience. When Joseph moves from Harmony, Pennsylvania, flees Harmony, Pennsylvania, really, to go to Fayette and goes into the Whitmer home, he doesn't anticipate that. He doesn't know the Whitmers, right? They're Oliver's friends, or David is Oliver's friend. Like he doesn't know them. He doesn't know them from Bar Sleep, except that he's this correspondence has, made him feel like, oh, this is somebody that I can trust enough to move and stay in their house, right? But he doesn't know them. But when he gets there, he finds that they are really excited about him. They're really excited about the Book of Mormon, and they get it read to them, because some of them are illiterate in English. They're German speakers, their first language. And they get it read to them, which is perfect for a play, because, actually the best way to absorb a play is for it being performed, which is being spoken out loud, right? And there's a major pivot when he gets to Fayette. And the biggest pivot is that he thinks he can recover the lost manuscript. Martin's just maybe hiding it, or testing them, or whatever it is. He's got a seer stone, so he's going to recover them at lost manuscript. Fourth Nephi is the end of the Book of Mormon. That's what the last bit to get written in Harmony. He's he gets on that wagon. He doesn't take the plates with him to Fayette or whatever he's got as a prop or thing, because he doesn't think he's going to need them, because he doesn't think that there's any more of the Book of Mormon, right? But he gets to Fayette, and the Whitmers, well, two things: can't recover the lost manuscript, no matter how hard he tries. And he probably does put the heavy on Martin Harris a number of times, maybe 3 times, just like Nephi does with Laban, right? And can't get it. So he has to replace the beginning. But the other thing that happens is that the Whitmers are real believers. They believe this, and they're really excited that this is something not just Christian-y. This is the beginning of a church, of a new dispensation, and they fill Joseph with a whole lot of new ideas, because it's not just one person in the room now, Oliver Cowdery, taking down his words, right? This is the whole Whitmer family, which is quite extensive.
They're cheerleaders. They're cheerleaders.
And so all of the things that are important to the Whitmers start to appear in the Book of Mormon, including, and most importantly, the anti-Catholic rhetoric in the Book of Mormon. All happens in Fayette. All the parts of the Book of Mormon that are written in Fayette have anti-Catholic sentiment, because they're anti-Catholic. So he's, it's going in his ear and it's coming out his mouth, right? Because he's a performer and he can hear from their reaction what things are important to them. And so he does more of the things that are important, and it comes out of his mouth. And Isaiah is one of those things. They are steeped in the Bible. They love Isaiah. And so he just keeps reciting it to them. And they telling him, maybe they're saying to him, oh, look, the voice of the dust, this is what we're talking about. And they're so excited that they're seeing the Book of Mormon and Isaiah. And so all of those things start to, come out Joseph's mouth. And that's why there's so much Isaiah.
And Joseph doesn't have his plates, but it doesn't matter because he has one of these.
Yeah, that's right. He can remote view the plates. The plates can be in harmony still, or they can be, I don't know where they are, wherever they are. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter to the Whitmers either, because they have seer stones. So they totally understand this premise, right? It's not like they need the plates to be around. It
makes so much sense that, as an entertainer, that Joseph would want to sort of play towards the desires of the people who are providing for him, and probably they're sitting around having discussions. The Whitmers are asking questions. And so Joseph is answering them through what he writes in the Book of Mormon. And I think it's so interesting. I never thought of that before, that the anti-Catholic sentiment came from the responses of the Whitmers. That's so interesting.
The whore of the earth.
You can check it too, because you can see that in the Doctrine and Covenants, when Joseph is giving revelations, and the revelations involve the Whitmers in some way, the anti-Catholic rhetoric comes up too, because he knows that that's their point, the thing that's their thing. That's the thing that makes them believe. So he does more of that. And when they're not around, he doesn't do it. There's no anti-Catholic rhetoric in Nauvoo, because the Whitmers are known they're not there.
Yeah, and it's so interesting too to think about this from the standpoint that, Joseph Smith is gathering followers. And as he goes along and he meets each of these people, he starts assigning them roles and giving them responsibilities and making sure that they have active involvement in the church being formed and built up and everything. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of those important people that he gathered around him and the roles that they played.
Oh, I love this part, right? We talk a lot. There's a lot of rhetoric about polygamy and how much he, does. And then there's very little rhetoric around the idea that Joseph involves himself in bromances all the time.
Absolutely.
Joseph loves men. He really loves men. I think if there's some bombshell in the church archive, I think that it's probably that Joseph is bisexual.
Sure. He probably was a good hugger, I bet.
He had some good hugs. He loved men. He loved going on adventures with men. He went on missions with men. He, spent months away from home with other men. He loved men. And so, yeah, he would make best friends with men all the time, and collaborate, give them roles. Of course, all of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants are to men, except for the one that he does to his wife, probably under duress. But he gives, he channels God for them, and gives them an assignment and a role and an importance and purpose, and adventures to go. He gives them adventures to go on. Sometimes when he's going to go with them, or sometimes when he sends them out on their own. Like this is just how he operates. So, and there's Martin Harris. He has fractious bromance with Martin Harris. He has an ongoing, really close association with Oliver Cowdery. He has a close association with his brothers, particularly Samuel and Hiram. And Hiram, that relationship strengthens over the years. He has a relationship with the Whitmer brothers and Hiram Page. That's quite significant. He obviously, Sidney Rigdon and him, form a long-term bromance that goes on for ages. We see him. Gosh, the Doctrine and Covenants is littered with his conquests. If we had to talk about, because we often talk about the women, which I get, and they're slightly nameless, so it's really important we talk about the women. But we actually have the names of the men, and we have quite the relationships and journal entries and things. These were really intimate relationships, at a really high level. Whether it's sitting around talking or discussing, whether it was going on adventures for particular reasons. Treasure digs were the first adventures he went on. Of course, they were always with men. And he continued that throughout his life. It wasn't that this stopped, right? Section 111 is him and Hiram and Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon going on a treasure hunt to Salem, Massachusetts, right? That's just one of several, bromance adventure, time, kind of things. You think of the people he got really close to really quickly, like John C. Bennett, even William Law, William Marks, Thomas B. Marsh. These guys, even when these relationships broke down, these people loved Joseph. That was the biggest betrayal, was that Joseph was doing something that undermined their core values. But up until that point, they tried lots of times to repair the relationship or do things. And Joseph was actually quite good at reconciling relationships when they went fairly south as well, right? But
he was so charismatic about that, and I think it's so interesting to see the ways that he did try to repair those relationships when he wanted to. It seems like there were some he didn't want to repair, and that he would move on from.
Well, I think that he would. I think that there were some of those relationships where it got beyond repair, or where it became an ultimatum between other people, right? So, how is he going to choose between Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery? When they're in conflict, right? How is he going to choose between John C. Bennett and the Nauvoo City Council when they're in conflict? So he's going to have to throw somebody under the bus, and he eventually throws Oliver Cowdery under the bus, and he eventually throws John C. Bennett under the bus. I don't think he wants to. He would rather reconcile, and those are big losses to him. In fact, I think in Carthage, he either writes a letter to Oliver Cowdery or just trying to reconcile with him, right? So it's not these these bromances are big for Joseph too. It's not like that they're just big for, he's not just using other people, and he does really feel for them, and they feel really cared about in those moments, right? But then
they were fiercely loyal to him for the most
Yeah.
part until there was some kind of betrayal.
Right.
Yeah.
The win-win relationship was big until something was big, like you say, the character issues, right, that they had. So Ganesh, you're going to be on Mormonism Live soon, we'll say, and you're going to talk about more of the juicy things. And I wanted to reiterate that we could just talk for just a second about some of the higher level, talk on a higher level about like the slavery issue was in the area, like you had already mentioned, the wars, the War of 1812, patriarchy were issues that were stewing at the time, and because you set the stage. That's like in the beginning of your book is talking about these issues that are brewing, right, that are in the mix. And so if you could just touch on a couple more things, we'll invite people to buy your book. I'll have a link in the description as well to how they can get your book on Amazon. And we'll also tell people to, after the show, head over to Mormonism Live, and we'll see what happens.
Fabulous. Well, yeah, you can absolutely get it on Amazon in print or in Kindle ebook, and you can go to Benchmark Books. They should have a copy too to be able to buy if you're in Salt Lake. Look, I can't emphasize this enough. Everything in the Book of Mormon you can link to Joseph and his environment. Every single thing. And a good example is this. In the book, I reference every single chapter in the Book of Mormon. Every one. And almost all of the Doctrine and Covenants, right? So, and this is because it's his world. And so when you start, hopefully one of the things that the book does, which is unique and fun, is take all of those topics and group them together so you can see them right next to each other. So you can see the passage in Mosiah against the passage in Helaman, against the passage in Ether, and against the passage in Second Nephi. And you can see that it's often the same wording, it's the same concept, and it's the same understanding of what's going on. And Dan McClellan talks about this all the time. He goes, the Bible is not univocal, right? It's a whole lot of different voices. So you can't use it like that. But the Book of Mormon's not. The Book of Mormon's one voice, and it's the same voice regardless of where in the timeline history it's supposed to be as a historical thing. That's how you can tell it's 19th century. That's how Dan McClellan tells that it's 19th century. So so the idea that you can go, okay, well, how does the concept of separation of church and state, which is a big deal in early 19th century America as they grapple with what is the political responsibility with a government and its people, how does the separation of church and state actually play out in the environment he's in, and then see that actually has a direct correlation to how it's represented in the Book of Mormon.
People don't know that around the War of 1812, there were still kingmen and freemen.
Yep, absolutely. And that the war changes that completely. Actually, the era of good feelings, which happens after the war, after basically America wins, or at least holds their position.
Ties better than Britain does.
Yeah, they get rid of all of the kingmen. Nobody's a kingman anymore because this is democracy, and we've now settled on it, and this is the trajectory of the United States. And that's the lesson of the Book of Mormon, right? Kings, if you could have a righteous king, that would be fabulous, but you can't. So a republic is necessary, and that's the lesson of the Book of Mormon, because that's the ideal, because that's the thing that he's growing up with, because he's a patriot. Except for the fact that when later on in his life this is failing him by Nauvoo, his ideas are not being valued in the greater, wider community. In fact, people are are thinking that he's a threat. And so now he's crowned as king. And he is the kingman. He's creating a city in Nauvoo where it's a separatist kingdom, where he's the king. He is a Malachi in Nauvoo in 1844. And he's crowned king.
Can't talk against the king at that point.
Can't talk against the king. You get put in jail. So those contradictions really show that it's him. I mean, we just absolutely talk, and absolutely the idea that the Book of Mormon is Joseph's 23-year-old idealistic self, just like our 23-year-old idealistic self when we thought we knew all of the answers to how life should be, right? And then Nauvoo is Joseph's 38-year-old. This is the practical reality, and I'm going to need to change my tune because my ideals from when I was a boy no longer hold water. I can't live like this. So my new reality is Nauvoo, and we hopefully the book makes the case that these two things are in tension, and they're in tension today even in the church, because there's the members are encouraged to read the Book of Mormon every single day, and there are parts of the church which are completely the opposite of the Book of Mormon, like building temples. The Book of Mormon speaks against that. Fine sanctuaries for the fine exclusive sanctuaries for the righteous, or that's around the anthem. And yet, so you read the Book of Mormon that says this is not a good idea. This is the great and spacious building, the pride of the world, the pride of the corrupt churches. On the one hand, on the Book of Mormon, and then in Nauvoo, Joseph's building this ornate building. He'd already built one in Kirtland. He's building another one in Nauvoo that's supposed to, everybody's supposed to come to. It's the pride of the city. It's the center part of the city. It's the flagship idea of the church. And this is how the church is today, right? The temple of your neighborhood signifies that you're amazing. White supremacy. Well, gosh, we could have a whole 2 hours on white supremacy.
At least, yeah.
Another show.
We could have 2 hours on patriarchy. We could have 2 hours on patriotism. We can have 2 hours, like every single chapter. Those 45 different chapters in 5 different sections. Set the world view, the way that Native Americans are in the story, the various theologies that Joseph was engaging in as a young person that changed during his life, the prejudices that Joseph was engaging in that changed during his life, and then his magic worldview that was underpinned his understanding of all of this. Those are the 5 sections. So
and we'd like to have you back and talk about sort of like either generational trauma or things that set up problems in the current day that still exist, like receiving personal revelation and thinking that Jesus is coming tomorrow, and which causes bad behavior and all the Mormon true crime that's happening, and somehow Megan's involved in some of that stuff.
Well, Megan could probably
not as a perpetrator. Let's be clear.
not as a perpetrator, as an observer, we'll say. Right. And so, and Megan's channel, Third Verse, which also has a midlife revolution, and Megan, you're pivoting a little bit. You're doing your own Joseph Smith thing, where you're going to talk about how, let's see, what's the word where somebody's really bad, where they think about themselves only?
Well, things that are at the intersection of narcissism and high demand religion and true crime, just the idea that narcissistic individuals and organizations cause a lot of problems in the world these days.
That's right. And so that's on the coattails of Joseph Smith, right? He ended his life with a slew of, we'll say, crimes that were broken, that were, I guess, never prosecuted, because when the perpetrator dies, it doesn't do a lot for prosecution and stuff like that.
Right.
This makes you wonder if Joseph Smith had stayed alive and wasn't killed by the mob, if there would be Mormonism today. Just never know.
To go just briefly down that tangent, Gene, I honestly think that it probably would still exist today, because we've seen this happen before, where beloved religious leaders get accused of crimes and incarcerated, and that just makes them more beloved because now they're persecuted for what they believe.
Right.
And so, whether
FLDS,
Yeah.
what's his name of Nexium, and
Keith Raniere.
Keith Raniere, right, among others. Yeah, and so yes, not maybe, but definitely different, right? Look,
different for sure, because if Brigham Young had never taken over, I think we would have seen a very different Mormon church as well.
And I look that all of what you've just said is my hope for the book, right? This individual, Joseph, that we have had so much to do with, so much of our current situation revolves around his particular issues that play out in various ways. But it's a good lens to look at so many other things, right? We can look at, Laurie Daybell. We can look at Keith Raniere. We can look at, these other individuals and how things play out. We maybe even be able to use it as a bit of a mirror to look at ourselves and go, at what points do we fudge things for our well-being and needs at the expense of others?
And how close are we to becoming kings of our own kingdom? That's what I'll say.
Yeah, that seems to have eluded me so far in my life, but I've got hope. I've got hope that it's still on its way. That's
right. The crowns of glory that we're all anticipating at some point in our lives.
Gosh, the Doctrine and Covenants promise those crowns of glory, and so everybody's going to be king according to the Oh well, actually, and to be fair, we've all role played that in the temple.
That's right. I was going to say, now we're just anointed. We're not there yet. We're just anointed.
If only we could have that second anointing where we are kings and priests and gods and goddesses and queens.
Well, I've heard that doesn't exist, so I don't know.
Super secret. If you know, you know.
I'll never reveal.
Go buy the book, and we'll get Ganesh on some more, and hopefully Megan will be able to join me on those. And if you're watching this and Mormonism Live's about to start, then go head over there to get even more Ganesh. And so if you like his voice, you can just turn his voice up in the background. If you just want to look at him, you turn down the sound and just watch him moving around while he's doing all that stuff.
And look, if nothing else, right, this is the appearance of gold. It's got
That's right.
Appearance of gold. So you can, and it's even got, like the background has got that lovely fake leather, kind of patterning there. So you can have your own, grain, thing. A little Easter egg is that gold is the.
What we don't get. What we don't get out of Joseph, and here's how he would have talked. Right, he would have said, "I like my coffee, Doc, and everybody go over there and do that." And he would talk like a Boston, like a Northeaster. And we never hear an accent, right? We need to get voice coaches to really show the true Joseph Smith someday, right? Vermont hillbilly.
It'd be different than we absolutely expect. Well, and we all create an image in our head, from various paintings and portraits, but also, various renditions, and so we build him up to be something that he wasn't, but something that we maybe identify with or love or can relate to. That's the beauty of a good story, isn't it? To be flexible enough to internalize it.
Any final words, Megan, before I sign off?
Well, I'm just grateful that you've done so much work to put this book together. I think I've enjoyed your TikToks as one of the people that I believe knows Joseph and his character probably more than anybody in the contemporary time. And I'm really excited to dig into more of your book. I started it a couple of days ago and didn't get as far as I wanted to because of everything that I'm working on. So I'm looking forward to some time to just sit down and really focus on it. And I can't wait to talk to you again after I've read more.
Well, maybe that's what we do next too, is, if you find a particular chapter that resounds with you, that has a real heart connection, and we track through that. So
That's right. I have one last issue with it. Since there was a connection to Freemasonry, you should have called him the Grand Architect of Mormonism. That's all I'll say.
That is actually a really good,
We'll see if future edition comes out with that.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Have a great rest of 2025. Bye-bye.